Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. In the past, I've shown you some completely awful Amiga arcade conversions of fighting games like Street Fighter and Street Fighter 2. There's really not much room for debate on those games. They're a couple of real stinkers, as are most fighting games that took the trip from the arcade to the 16-bit computer. Now, you might think that Amiga Mortal Kombat is just as bad as the rest of these arcade conversions. If you think that,
well, you're wrong!
Normally you'd find these Amiga versions of arcade games like this in an episode of Complete Trash, but instead, welcome to an episode of How About That, where I take a look at a game that's surprising in a positive way for the platform on which it finds itself. Now, I'm not saying Amiga Mortal Kombat is exactly good, but I'll cover all of that stuff during the commentary. Quick note on recording methodology for this video. Now, the game originally shipped on 2 floppy disks either in 1993 or 1994, depending on which source you believe. The reason I'm mentioning that is being on floppy disks, it has some pretty long load times on an actual machine. I'm playing this on an emulator and using some save states to make things easier, but it still took me close to an hour to play through this one. I've eliminated most of the load times in the actual game for the playthrough, so I'm not wasting any of your time, but I will talk about load times in places where they would normally occur. With that out of the way, let's get on with it. Alright, here we go. The Amiga version of Mortal Kombat was distributed by Virgin, particularly in the UK at least, but it was developed by Probe, the same company that had worked on the Genesis version previously. And you can tell this one definitely shares assets with that version of the game. We'll see all that in just a moment or two. Man, does this game have a whole lot of splash screens. We're going to see them just for another few seconds. Well, Probe isn't exactly known for high-quality software. They did okay with a few games, and Mortal Kombat's one of them. And if you listen here, we have a very nice, rendition of some music. And we even look at this, get little quick video intros of the characters like the arcade version. Things that are missing from most of the home versions. Now, unfortunately for the music, while it sounds really good, there's not going to be a lot of it. And I'll talk about more of that in just a moment. And if you look at this screen, it looks basically identical to the title screen on the Genesis. I didn't open the options, but again, it looks the same. And here we have our character select. And this is where things go not so terribly right. You can tell the colors are really stripped down. There's no animation of the characters. And as we look at the, roster of fighters for the tournament here, you can tell, again, still have decent sounding music and everything, and There's long load times that I cut out here. I want to stress that. I know I talked about it in the video intro, but I'll talk more about it later. So here we are into the game, and you can see it looks a lot like a super cut down version of the Genesis game. So in the Genesis version, the monks, animate, and there's parallax scrolling layers, and it runs at 60 frames a second. On the Amiga, we don't have any of those things. And this runs on the OCS Amiga systems, the original chipset, so things that or like the Amiga 1000, which came out in 1985 and was the first of the line, or the later cost-reduced Amiga 500, or slightly fancier Amiga 2000. So, what the Amigas have in their favor is they have a much larger color palette than the Genesis, with 4,096 colors, but they can only show 32 on screen at once. Now, they can show parallax scrolling, full-screen parallax, but that comes at the expense of the amount of colors you can show on screen per layer. So that's why a lot of games don't use it. Anyway, here is Mortal Kombat. We did our first fatality. There you go. Tore Liu Kang's head right off. Yep, we've got it in all its gory fantabulism. And you'll notice they have pretty good speech samples in this game. A lot of speech samples that are missing from the Genesis version. So that's something the Amiga version has over it, and they're pretty high quality. So the load times after each fight, I gotta stress, are pretty long. And you'll be sitting on this roster screen for the tournament, the schedule for it, for quite a while after every single fight. So I want to stress that this is much faster, than you would actually get to play this game. Now, still having said that, as an experience on the Amiga back in around 1994-ish, it was really tough to play this when you had the console versions available, but I went through it a few times on real hardware. I grew up with Amigas, unlike a lot of people in the US. My dad was a big Amiga fan. He had the original Amiga 1000 when it first came out, and later we had some 500s, and at least one 1200. I can never remember if we had one or two of those. We didn't have any of the CD-based systems, and we didn't have any CD-ROM drives for, the 1200 or anything like that. So we just had base Amigas all the way through, along with some, additions like extra RAM and things like that. So here is the end of Sonya Fatality. You can tell they do not hold back on the blood. Now, those of you who are observant may have noticed that this had the same code screen that you see on the Genesis one, where it talks about having a secret code. Well, there is a secret code in this game. It has nothing to do with enabling or disabling the violence, really. It does other stuff. So the violence is on by default in the Amiga version. You don't have to do anything special. So here's our next background here on the Amiga. And this one comes off a lot better. It looks a lot more similar to the Genesis version than the other two backgrounds we've seen so far. They're still pretty far cry from the arcade version. You can tell we have a lot of cut down animation, and this frame rate is generally, I would say, looks like it's about half of what we would get in the console versions for the Amiga. You know, it's capable of 60 hertz or 60 frames per second in the US and NTSC territories. In PAL territories where it had more fame, it was a lot more popular in general, they maxed out at 50 hertz. So that's why you would see a lot of games that either ran slow or had weird timing issues in the 8 and 16-bit console and computer eras. And Mortal Kombat here speeds up and slows down at times, and you can see at times, for some reason, it runs at like the max frame rate that the computer is capable of handling. But it only does that in very tiny short bursts that you'll see here and there. And I recorded this video at 60 frames a second, so when it runs at a higher frame rate, you will see that. Alright, and I will talk about controls when we start the next fight. But before we do that, we have some more business to take care of first. Here's Test Your Might. So on this one, instead of pressing the low punch and low kick buttons and then hitting block to execute the strike, you just waggle the joystick left and right, and then press the button to attack. Do your chop. Alright, so here we go on to Raiden and the Pit, and wow, does this one look plain? They took all the clouds out. In every other version of the game, or the major 16-bit versions, including the arcade one, you've got lots of clouds, scrolling by in the background. They did keep things flying by the moon in the Amiga version, so that's nice. And they did keep the fatality in this stage, which we'll see in a little bit. But I promised to talk about controls, so let's do that. So on the Amiga, if you weren't aware, it was designed primarily with single-button joysticks in mind, just like people have been using since the Atari 2600 days, and you can actually plug an Atari 2600 joystick right into an Amiga and use it if you want. So the Amiga is capable of reading way more buttons than that. And later games tended to almost sort of stealth support two-button controllers like the Sega Master System controller, but there's no reason that it couldn't have supported more, other than they just decided not to. Developers didn't do it because those things weren't out there. So let's look at the fatality here. You'll notice something. Hey, where'd he go? There's no scrolling. We just go from one screen to the next, and they just fall and land flat in the pit. And you'll notice also, much like the original Genesis version, when you hit the spikes, there's nothing else down there. There's no skeletons or body parts or heads mounted on the spikes. We would see some of that stuff return in later versions. So let's move on to Kano. So going back to the one-button joystick, and wow, this is the worst looking stage in the entire game. This stage looked a little rough in the Genesis version, and ported to the Amiga with a smaller amount of on-screen colors, it looks dramatically worse. But anyway, controls. So how do you play this game that, used 5 buttons in the arcade with a single button joystick on the Amiga, or at best, 2-button controller? You would think that, they would translate the controls terribly into such a limited system, but they actually did a really good job, I must admit here. So, if you're playing with a one-button joystick, all your punches and kicks and specials are all pulled off with the single button. Usually you're pressing a direction along with that button to do something. So down, and the button is an uppercut, which you just saw there. To do Sub-Zero's Ice Blast attack here, it's just diagonally down forward. You don't have to roll it, just press it and press the button. And if you didn't know, you can actually do that in the Genesis version too. You don't have to do a fireball motion. You can just press diagonally down, forward, and then, press low punch in that version. In this version, it's just the button. And I'll talk more about controls right after we rip Kano's head off. Alright, so let's get back to these controls here. So, you do basically a sweep by pressing down back in the button. You do a roundhouse kick by pressing back in the button. If you use a 2-button controller instead, The second button executes basically all of your kick moves, while the other button still does everything it did before. So you'll have a mix, of punches and kicks in there. So in the end, this works pretty well, but not everything translates great. So like for Sub-Zero's slide there, for example, you have to do that by pressing forward, back, forward, and then the button. And you have to do it at this, the exact right time, or it doesn't work right. So what do I mean by that? For example, after I freeze, characters and then uppercut them, you have to wait a split second because it's not reading inputs right away. So you have to give it some time to start reading inputs again before you execute that slide motion, or nothing happens. So you have to really get good and kind of practice, and get in on the timing on everything in order to execute that slide regularly. And while it's fairly easy to do after an uppercut, it's a lot harder to do after a jump kick. Now, even with these drastic changes, overall, I would say Amiga Mortal Kombat still plays relatively faithfully close to the arcade version. As far as Amiga arcade fighting conversions go, I mean, this is about as good as it gets, folks. Most of the other ones are pure garbage. This one, they made some real effort, and they had that base, that they created for the Genesis version to work with, at least. And it's too bad we didn't see really more of that happening back at this time. So anyway, you'll notice more things here, like the colors for Johnny Cage's Shadow Kick and Fireball are weird. One thing I hadn't had a chance to talk about yet is when Sub-Zero freezes characters, sometimes the freezing colors get really weird. And you want to see really weird freezing colors? Just you wait until I get to the mirror match. And the other thing that you'll surely have noticed by now, and I mentioned earlier that there wasn't a lot of music in this game, there is only one song that plays during regular fights in Amiga Mortal Kombat. Just that one song. You've heard it all throughout. It's a very good version of it. The Amiga uses, samples. It's sample-based sound hardware. So a lot of its stuff has the ability to sound great. But anyway, let's get back on to our mirror match here. You will see some fun moments on this one, but look, I froze the computer Sub-Zero. He didn't even change color. You have no way of knowing that he's frozen other than the fact that you connected with him there. He froze me, you can't tell. Now you'd think that Probe would have managed to do something like, just make it all white or all the lightest color that appears on the character, just so you know something happened. I don't know why they didn't do that. We'll have a nice moment during this round where we freeze each other, and it just looks super weird with the two Sub-Zeros just standing there looking at each other, apparently doing nothing. There you go, right now. Thankfully, freezing doesn't last all that long. Now, one thing I will also mention with the leg sweep is I found that a little bit hard to execute, and it was less reliable than most of the other moves. Like, doing the uppercut is super easy, doing the roundhouse kick is super easy, but doing that low leg sweep, for some reason, it just didn't register all the time. Now, the controls in general are pretty responsive in this game, and much better than most other Amiga fighting games that, are ported from arcade games. So I gotta give Probe props for that also. Now, having said all that, I don't want to make this game out to be more than it is. I can't imagine anyone, except for nostalgic reasons, wanting to play this over either the arcade version in this day and age, or, over, say, the Genesis or Super Nintendo one. I mean, honestly, there are things about the gameplay I like better than the Super Nintendo version in this one, but overall, it is definitely not as polished as that version, even though that version has lots of problems. Now, the endurance round here, lots of problems, is a great segue into it, because on real hardware, this is awful. When you knock the first character out, it stops and it loads for a good, 20 to 30 seconds. For the first one, I left it in here so you can see how long it takes. That's quite a while, while you're waiting. For all the other ones, I shorten it so you're not sitting there waiting. But I wanted you to at least see what we were dealing with here. And I will also mention, on, the real Amiga hardware for playing with floppy disks, there's quite a bit of disk swapping you've got to do, throughout the game here if you have a single drive. If you had 2 floppy drives, then it wasn't bad. You would get an experience more like what you see here, just with the extra loading that I've cut out. where you didn't have to constantly flip discs. It would just, be seamless. It would just load things. It would just take a while. One thing I do not miss is the era of floppy disks. Man, were they slow. If you never experienced that yourself, they were awful. But that's a tale for another time. So there is Kano taken down again. One thing that was kind of annoying with this one is I had to fight two characters twice in the endurance round. I saw Raiden in two different fights, and was it Kano? I don't know. We'll see in a second. It might have been Johnny Cage. I think it was Johnny Cage and Raiden. We'll find out when we see the tournament roster again in just a moment. By the way, I'd love to know how these people came back when, I already tore all their heads off before. If you're wondering how Sub-Zero's fatality works in this, it's much like you'd expect. It's just forward, down, forward, and then the button. In the other versions, it'll be forward, down, forward, and then high punch. On this one, it's the only punch. Yeah, it's Johnny Cage and Raiden that I fight twice, mixed in with Kano and Sonya. So here I'll show you that spectacular pit fatality again, so don't worry, you're not going to miss that. I wish I could have done something here. Even if you had just a couple of still clouds drawn onto the background, it would have looked a little nicer. As it is, just so much of this version looks plain and unfinished. None of, the stuff made for Amiga Mortal Kombat, takes advantage of AGA hardware, which is what we see in the newer Amigas, like the 1200, that allow for things like 256 colors on screen in standard graphics modes. Instead, we're left with what we've got here. And not a lot of games really took great advantage of the AGA color palettes and the other things that they offered, unfortunately. So it's just part of the reason that the Amiga as a platform was heavily underutilized compared to the power that the machine offered. We see glimpses of it with some, visually, and auditorially great games, I guess. Things like Shadow of the Beast, the Turrican series, Turrican 1, 2, and 3. But there's so many games that they just... Either the developers were on a super crunch time, just didn't have the skill, they were too small, things were just worked on by one person, they had to have everything done a lot of times to make sure a game was released by the holidays. There were a lot of reasons for it. And here is our lovely pit fatality one more time. Fantastic. Well, not really. But anyway, that's the end of the pit. We're not going to see that again. Here is the final test your might. Look at that, I filled the meter up all the way, just to show you that I could. Alright, we are heading into the end game here, folks. So this is Endurance Round 3. After this, we just have Goro and Shang Tsung. So here's Goro's lair in this version, and wow, that floor is ugly. Again, heavily based on the Genesis version, but they changed the color from the more, grayish that we saw in the Genesis version to whatever this is. Remember, I'm a bit colorblind, so I can't really tell what that one is. There's Raiden, he went down pretty easy this time. Here comes Johnny Cage again. And if you haven't seen it yet, I highly suggest that everybody go check out the trailer for the second Mortal Kombat movie that's about to come out as I record this, starring Carl Urban as Johnny Cage. It is pretty hilarious. Now, I did not like the first Mortal Kombat movie from a few years ago. I did like the more campy one from like 1994-ish. I think it was 94. That one was good, and I thought that was way better than the new one. The new one didn't look nearly as cheesy, and it had much better effects and everything, but the story stunk. We had a made-up character as the protagonist. Whoever wants to see that? It just wasn't good. It was a movie about a tournament where the tournament doesn't even actually take place. Why would you do that? And no, the context of the story in the movie doesn't really make sense, in my opinion. Anyway, back to the game at hand here. So we're about to finish off things here with Johnny Cage, and we're going to see Goro come in right after this. So again, on the real hardware, it would freeze for a moment. There would be some loading. You'd hear those floppy disks spinning and accessing. Things would just be completely still for a little bit, and then Goro would appear right after that. But thanks to the magic of modern video editing, hey look, there he is right away. No load times. Doesn't look all that great. Again, he looks quite small compared to how he should be, and we are missing quite a few animation frames and colors, but so be it. It's just how it is. Limitations, I guess. Goro is kind of a pushover when you're playing a Sub-Zero, at least. It's very susceptible to being, jump kicked and frozen. Two things that Sub-Zero is pretty good at. And yes, I know, he's the only one that can freeze people in this game. So one of the things I'll mention sound-wise that I was a little disappointed in is while we had Scorpion's iconic "Get over here" line, we don't have Raiden's "Jumping Broccoli" or those "Rah, rah, 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 rah." Those things are iconic too. Why don't we have those? Why did they take those out? Surely you could have squeezed in Raiden's gibberish lines. And they are gibberish, by the way. If you didn't know, the developers, I can't remember if it was Ed Boon or somebody else, talked about how it is actual gibberish and he's not actually saying anything. So here's our fight with Shang Tsung, and you can see that in this version, I've only ever seen him transform into either the character that's playing against him, or in some rare instances, Goro, which we don't see a Goro transformation here. So it's a little weird to me, because the Amiga, standard Amigas after the original, 1000, typically had 512 kilobytes of RAM, as standard. So surely they could have stored, at least, 3 or 4 characters in there and had a few at random so we could transform into a much greater variety of characters to more closely mimic what he does in the arcade and console versions. One other oddity that you may have just seen there is sometimes Sub-Zero's projectile will just override and cancel out another projectile that's happening right at the same time, right as it's starting while the ice blast hits it. So I sort of ate one of Shang Tsung's fireballs there. It happened with some of Johnny Cage's fireballs a little bit earlier too. But anyway, that's it. We have just finished Amiga Mortal Kombat. And much like it had, a little bit of that animation or video, which really is just a few frames for the characters for their intros, we do have some of the still graphics for their endings too. And with these floppy disks on the Amiga, the approximate size of this, it'd be equivalent to a console game that is on roughly a 16 megabit cartridge. So that's why they had room to add some of this other stuff and a lot of those other voices. It's also why it's incredibly disappointing that there's only one music track that takes place during the actual fighting. I would much rather have had, an additional 3 music tracks instead of having the pretty pictures of the characters in the intros or the endings. Surely they could have sacrificed the intros or the endings to have more music, which I think would have worked a lot better for this game. But anyway, here's our cast roll. After we see all the cast of characters, the actors that portrayed the characters, we will see the developers, as we do in most other versions. Again, this takes a while. There's some loading, there's some pausing in here. And I'm actually going to cut some of it to make this a little bit faster. And here we also see the credit for the stop motion miniature that is Goro. You can see the colors on Shang Tsung in particular, not even remotely close to what they should be. Now the Amiga did also have a lot of other color modes. It also had what was called Ham Mode or Hold and Modify, where it could show all 4096 of its colors on screen at once. Not many games utilize that, but there are a few. Now, one other thing I will talk about and squeeze in briefly here as we let these end credits finish is the Amiga doesn't typically use sprites for most of its games. It has sub-sprite capabilities, but it can only show a maximum of 8 sprites on the screen at once. And they're sort of Neo Geo-ish. They can be the height of the entire screen, but they can only be very thin strips that are up to 16 pixels wide. So that's why you don't see a lot of games rely on sprites. Most of the time, instead, they rely on what we call bobs or blitter objects. And the blitter is just another method of speeding up graphics rendering that was used in place of sprites. It's kind of ironic that the Amiga doesn't have better sprite hardware built in, especially considering that it started life when it was originally in the design phase as a potential new game console, and it was shifted to a computer later. Alright folks, so I'm not gonna blab on too much more here. We're right at the end of this. And in fact, I'm gonna cut a little short, sorry for the credits, and we're gonna wrap things up. As we wrap things up, I will show you a little mini comparison of the Amiga version next to the arcade version, and also next to the Genesis version on which it's based. So you can get an idea, of what was sacrificed in the trip, well, both home from the arcade and to the computer world from the console world. So there you go, that's Amiga Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat 2 also came to the computer, and maybe I'll take a look at that one down the road sometime. Now in the end, Amiga MK is okay. As I said, it's not exactly good, but it is way better than most of the other arcade fighting conversions that found their way onto the platform. It plays a bit differently than the arcade original, but at least it has more of its spirit intact and is actually worth checking out, unlike tripe like Street Fighter 1 and 2 on the Amiga. Alright, so tell me folks, what did you think? Had you seen this version of Mortal Kombat before? Did you just see it for the first time in this video? How do you think Probe did on this one? And what's your favorite home version of Mortal Kombat 1? Tell me all about it in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell so you won't miss any of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through channel memberships and super thanks. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.